I've been to this castle before to run a D&D game, and it went very badly. A few years ago, I was hired to run 24 hours of D&D over 3 days at an event that was costing my players thousands of dollars to attend. I had no experience with professional DMing, and long story short, I ended up having my first panic attack in a 600-year-old haunted English castle. Couldn't have picked a cooler location for a breakdown, honestly. You can watch the video for the whole dramatic story. A year later, they invited me back, and despite how miserable the first time was for me, I said yes. If I'm totally honest, I felt a lot of shame for how much I struggled that first year. Yes, I managed to figure it out by the end, and yes, my players had a great time. But part of why it took me years to make that video is because I was embarrassed that it was so difficult for me. My old friend imposter syndrome had set up camp in my brain wearing a D&D in a castle t-shirt. And you know what? I'm sick of it. There are enough randos online saying that I don't deserve to take up so much space in this community. They don't need me backing them up. I learned a lot of lessons that first year, and that included seeing firsthand how much I was holding myself back. The fact is, I do know what I'm doing. I am a great dungeon master. I can stroll into D&D in a castle for the second time, ready to chew bubblegum and start my redemption arc. And wouldn't you know it, I chewed all my bubblegum on the 9-hour flight over. There were 3 main things that went wrong the first time. 1, I ran a mystery, the kind of adventure that works great in a home game when the timeline is flexible, but is a huge risk for an event that has to exactly fit a specific number of sessions. 2, I didn't lean into my strengths. I built in a lot of combat because that felt like what I was supposed to do, but I knew that I tended to be too soft on players in combat, and sure enough, it became a problem. And 3, I let my own fears and insecurities completely destroy me, to the point where I had a total crash out, all because of self-doubt. You know, one thing I've noticed talking with you guys, especially at conventions like Gen Con just a few weeks ago, is that women are really hesitant to label ourselves DMs. I'll ask a fan, "Are you a DM?" And she'll hem and haw, she'll say, "I wanna be," or "I've only run a few sessions," or "Not a very good one." Let me tell you something, sister, men do not say that to me. They just say yes. That is a skill everybody needs to become proficient in. That's a skill I need to become proficient in. I had already proven that I could go to D&D in a castle and run a game my players loved, but somehow I still felt like I'd failed, entirely because of what was going on inside my head. So this time, it isn't about proving myself, it's about trusting myself, and that starts with writing a great adventure. Because everybody is traveling to a specific location and staying on site for the event, the D&D games at the castle have a very strict time limit. We are specifically told that we need to run 24 hours of D&D across 3 days. Now, if you've ever DM'd before, you know that predicting how long a game is going to take is challenge rating 1000. We've all heard of 1-shots turning into 3 shots or 4 shots, and as soon as you think you're prepared for that, you'll suddenly get a party that races through your content like they're trying to set a speedrun record. My first year at D&D in a castle, I'd written a mystery because that sounded like fun to me. But when I ran up against the time constraints of the event, that format became a real problem. Somehow players that struggle with your ages to and up puzzles magically turn into the love child of Benoit Blanc and Hercule Poirot the moment you try to run a mystery. So this time I decided to pick the format based on the constraints, and then figure out what version of that format would be fun for me. Basically reverse engineering my adventure to fit D&D in a castle. That meant having a lot of control over the pace, which naturally made me think about dungeon crawls.
Creativity needs boundaries. Dungeons constrain a complex world and bound it by walls and doors and floors and ceilings, and within these boundaries you have near infinite space to create.
It will probably surprise no one to hear that I, a blue hair and pronouns woke D&D player from the Critical Role generation, don't have a ton of experience with dungeon crawls. Obviously, they're a fundamental part of the game. Dungeons crawled so that dragons could walk, so that ampersands could run. In recent years, dungeon crawls have fallen out of favor compared to more open world gameplay concepts. But one thing I've always really liked is a self-contained setting, and dungeons are great for that. You can decide upfront what's in every room and passage, and then no matter what choices your players make, you're prepared for what they find. The problem is, dungeons aren't really my aesthetic. And this might sound silly, but aesthetics and vibes are a really big part of how I write and run adventures. The idea of leading my players through dark, grimy underground tunnels just didn't really excite me, and it didn't feel like a Ginny D game. So instead, I decided to keep the topic firmly planted in the fantastical, the imaginary, the delightfully make-believe, public transportation. Yes, I'm American, why do you ask? I was inspired by books and movies like Murder on the Orient Express, Snowpiercer, Bullet Train, Train to Busan, but instead of an industrial aesthetic, this train would be magic, an interplanar transport system created by the Fae to connect the material plane and the Feywild. The train itself would be a living plant, powered by a Fae spirit that lives inside the train the way that a dryad lives inside a tree. If you're wondering why I have all this gorgeous custom art, it's because I turned this adventure into a book, and I went embarrassingly hard on it. It's launching in my shop today. I described what I wanted on the cover to Kyle Cox, the artist, and he was like, "This will be very hard and very expensive." And I was like, "Sounds good. Have at it." What was I supposed to do? Not have a Where's Waldo style scene featuring both major and minor NPCs? Look, here's the train's mechanic Tussock Frostfur, a chonky caterpillar wearing a tool belt. How could I not include him? Anyway, the train hops into the Astral Sea on its way to the Feywild, and then, of course, it breaks down. You just can't find reliable interplanar transit these days. This leaves the players to identify and fix the problem so that they can get to their destination. Inciting incident? Check. Self-contained setting? Check. Obscene number of plants? Check. Okay, but a train isn't a dungeon where you choose what path to take. Isn't a train just like a literal railroad? A straight line that has to be traveled in order? Well, yes, a real train would be that, but we're talking about the Fae here. I don't think there's anything less Fae than being straight. Sure, the cars exist in a certain order, and you can travel through them that way, but this train is also magic, and I made sure there were plenty of different paths that players could use. They could go outside the train, as long as they're willing to brave the dangers of the Astral Sea, which I personally would not be, but I also don't investigate strange noises in my own house without a sword. And of course, I threw in some tricksy portals. Fae go crazy for a tricksy portal. But also, the route you take isn't the only impactful choice you make in a dungeon. Players are deciding how to manage their resources, interacting with NPCs, and choosing which problems to solve and which to pass by. There's a hag on board the train, and players have to decide if it's worth fighting her, or avoiding her, or making a deal with her, or letting her inspire you to reject the societally mandated performance of youth and femininity in favor of embracing the wild, ungovernable beast within. There are a lot of options. Another benefit of a dungeon when trying to control the pace of an adventure is the potential for modularity. In a dungeon, you can add extra rooms if players are moving too fast. And after extensive research, I discovered that you can also make trains longer with a sort of train room known as a car. In the lore of this adventure, the train to the Feywild is not the only interplanar rail line. There was also once a train that went from the material realm to the Nine Hells, nicknamed Hell on Wheels. On one journey, it was attacked by an astral behemoth. The only way the passengers and crew survived was by severing the final 4 cars and leaving them behind to float in the Astral Sea forever. See? Henry Ford warned us, this kind of thing would never happen with an automobile. So if my players were moving a bit too fast and I needed to fill more time, those missing cars could reappear, crashing into the train at any time. This introduces a brand new set of cars to explore, complete with new creatures that had the bonus of feeling very different from the Fae themes dominating the rest of the adventure. And if I was running on schedule, the cars would just never appear. Some say they're still floating out there, waiting for the next DM whose players solved a puzzle too quickly. I am not gonna lie to you and say this adventure was perfect. In fact, my clever modular missing cars had a fundamental weakness that I didn't spot until I was at the castle. In the original version of the adventure, the cars crashed into the side of the train, opening up a possible new route that branched off from the main train. Now, in my home games, I'm usually playing with the kinds of people who love pressing a big red button. I am not used to running games for cautious players who do sensible things, like decide not to waltz into the dangerous new cars for no good reason, which is why in the published version of this adventure, the missing cars actually split the train, so players have to use them to reconnect the two halves. Live and learn. And laugh and love. But that little hiccup didn't send me into the same spiral I had experienced the first time around. I knew what this event demanded, and this time I'd built an adventure that gave me the tools to handle it. I couldn't predict every choice my players would make, but I didn't need to. I had a structure I could trust. Once I stopped spending so much energy worrying about whether my adventure would hold together, I had a lot more brain space for the parts of DMing that I'm really good at. Groan-worthy puns. Just kidding. I mean, I'm not kidding, I am great at puns. You might even call it my forte, but only if you say it really loudly. One of my biggest strengths is creating and role-playing NPCs. I will happily spend a whole session just chatting back and forth with my player characters as some shopkeep or guard or awakened houseplant. And it's not just that I'm good at this, it's also a ton of fun for me. My idea of a killer Friday night is coming up with a voice for that dying orchid in the window.
Oh, Papa, I fear I haven't long.
The rot has taken my roots. One thing I learned in my first year at D&D in a Castle is that when I'm having fun, I'm a better DM. So the Fae Train, full of NPCs. I actually had to cut probably a dozen NPCs from the published adventure because when I'm just prepping for myself, there is no ceiling. I wanted to make sure that at any time my players could stop a fellow passenger or a crew member and I would be ready with a cast of unique, whimsical characters that would be a blast to roleplay. I don't mind coming up with characters who never come into play because inventing them in the first place is still fun for me. But once you start printing them in a book, there is a literal cost associated with each NPC, so I had to get a little pickier. The ones that ended up in the book are mostly the ones that my players found interesting enough to interact with. This means if your players run afoul of Rosary, the bored, sexy vampire taking a vacation to the Unseelie Court, you have my player character Fable to thank. I admit I was not prepared for her to immediately be like, sure, mysterious stranger with pointy teeth, I'll follow you into a dark private place. Let this be a lesson. If you put a sexy vampire in your game, you gotta be prepared to deliver on both those words. I had some fun NPCs in the mystery I ran during my first year at D&D in a Castle, but also it was a horror story with plenty of scenes that took place in the middle of the wilderness, exploring or fighting monsters. And of course, my bad guys were the evil, corrupted spirits of the dead. And by that I mean they weren't exactly chatty. I think all of these things were the right choices for that particular adventure. But considering how much I love roleplay, they weren't necessarily the right choices for leaning into my strengths. So with Fae Train, I did the opposite. There were tons of NPCs to interact with, friendly, neutral, and hostile. All of my villains were characters with their own motivations, able to converse with the players if they so chose. And many of the encounters could be resolved with roleplay. Now, to be clear, I am not interested in completely removing combat from D&D. It is a core pillar of the game. It's central to the mechanics. And why would I be carrying around this sword if I didn't enjoy the occasional fight to the death? But if the only goal of combat is to present a challenging fight, I am not your girl. Over time, I've figured out where my strengths lie when it comes to encounters, and it is not in hitting hard or being a strategic mastermind with monsters. Of course, I love creating encounters that don't require combat, but are more than just a skill check. This adventure has riddles, it has social challenges, it even has a game called Mimic Sweeper that began as a reskinned version of Minesweeper, until I realized how hard it is to manually run Minesweeper. It's just counting, Ginny. Okay, well, it turns out I can't count. But even in my combat encounters, I think my DMing really shines when there's a goal beyond just make enemy dead. Players need to get past a giant teleporting snail, but the exotic animal dealer who brought it on board asks that they cage it instead of killing it. They need to get through an underwater train car, but the villain's minions are freezing the water. They don't have to kill all the minions, but they do need to get through the door. I think the last encounter in the adventure is the best example of this. I always knew that the final confrontation wouldn't be the boss fight. There is a boss fight, obviously. I have some respect for tradition. But after that, in order to save the day, the players need to help the spirit of the train defeat a dark, corrupting entity. Fae are deeply connected to emotion, so I gave each player a very open-ended challenge. Contribute something emotionally meaningful to strengthen the spirit of the train. Maybe that's an item they treasure, or an important memory, or a secret they've been keeping. One of my player characters at the castle had spent the adventure being visited by the spirit of his dead wife. I'm sure you know where this is going. She had appeared to him several times throughout the game, and when we reached that final moment, he decided to let her go. He asked her to lend her strength to the Fae spirit and then move on for good. This was the second time that I had cried like a little baby at Lumley Castle, but at least this time I didn't do it alone. I had written the encounter, but I hadn't written that ending. I couldn't have. That came entirely from my players, and it was better than anything I could have planned. That moment felt like the payoff to everything I had been trying to do differently this time. I had built exactly the kind of adventure that could support the story we wanted to tell together. Something playful and surprising and narrative, and even, once it felt earned, emotional. And the only reason this all worked is because I trusted myself. This adventure was not flawless. Sure, I learned a lot from my first year at D&D in a Castle, but I faced new challenges this time, and I've screwed up new things. There will always be more to learn. But being a great DM doesn't mean nothing surprises you, it just means you're able to adapt to those surprises. And I did that both years at D&D in a Castle. The only difference is that the second time, I had faith in my ability to adapt. I want to deliver this message to everyone watching this, but especially to the girlies, because I think we really need to hear this. You don't have to be perfect to be allowed to do something. something. You don't deserve punishment for getting things wrong, and you don't have to apologize for knowing what you got right. I am not perfect, but I am a great dungeon master. I have made and will continue to make many mistakes, but I will also do things very well, and I'm allowed to be proud of that. Trouble on the Fae Train is an adventure that only I would have made. It feels uniquely mine, and I couldn't have made it if I didn't embrace that. I feel confident that people are gonna have a lot of fun running it at their tables. I'm actually about to run it for some of my friends, something I've never done with one of my adventures after publication. If you want to get the adventure, it's available in print as a PDF and at a discount for Foundry VTT for the first 30 days. I also partnered with Dispel Dice to create this beautiful Fae mushroom-themed dice set called Mystic Mycelium that we offered at Gen Con, and we have a few sets left, although I suspect that they will sell out very quickly. Visit ginnyd.com/shop, where in the spirit of the Feywild, we can make a bargain. You give me your money, and I give you a book. Unusually straightforward for Fae.